And as Azhar said, leading off from the end of the day, we are going to talk about SDN, but we are saying if we can't define SDN, what it is, what isn't SDN? So that's really the question here. And so let me introduce to you the excellent group of panelists that we have here this evening. We have almost the entire ecosystem represented here. And I'd like the panelists, as I call out your names, to just kind of nod or raise your hand so the audience knows who you are. So we have Andy Malice from Verizon, Maria from AT&T, Thomas from Orange, Dan Pitt representing the ONF, Justin from Huawei, Francois from Ericsson, Kirti, of course, from Juniper, Matthew, Alcatel-Lucent, and Dave from Cisco. So these are the large vendors, and then we have, of course, the access vendors and the optics guys, Yakov from RAD, who you just heard, and Zeev from MRV. So it's a great mix, and the panelists and I really want to thank you for being here this evening. And before we kick it off, let's just kind of warm up and give ourselves, yourselves, and the panelists a big hand to start with. Some of them have traveled from very far just to be here for the panel, and they came just today. So the story actually for this panel began with a series of roundtable discussions where we began pondering about the questions for SDN. And I'll leave you to read the story and listen to the audios and the transcripts at the blog that I've listed here. And there's a whole series of roundtables that are recorded there for those who are interested in what happened behind the scenes. And I'd also like to acknowledge a number of different industry experts that we were successful in bringing onto those roundtables, whose inputs are reflected in many of the discussions you'll see here. Hector Avalos from Ericsson was very key in talking about a number of aspects of virtualization. We had Mark from Alcatel-Lucent, Casimir from IBM, Mike Frado and Tom Knoll, who are industry analysts, Steve West from Cyan, which is very big in SDN, and Chris Liu from Infinera gave us a transport perspective, and Isabel talked about what are the different companies doing SDN. And I guess the basic question is, why are we even talking about this subject? And I think throughout the day we've seen a lot of arguments for doing that. I've just kind of captured them here. Basically, operators, as we know, are looking to simplify operations and reduce complexity. That's what a number of different talks this morning, the keynotes, talked about. And we're trying to lower total cost of ownership and achieve greater profitability. In short, we're trying to all tackle the efficiency crunch that Xipeng talked about, and we are trying to bridge the gap between the applications and the network's understanding of each other, which is what Sunil said. And finally, the need for orchestration between the cloud and the WAN, which we heard from Dave. So that's kind of what the operator community is coming from, and what we are trying to do here is software-defined networking and software-defined networks. Are they paradigms and technologies that will enable the telecom operators to really move towards that evolution? And what is the role of SDN in doing that? Right? And the value for the audience, I'm hoping, is that we invite you to participate actively, to raise your hand, ask questions, and hopefully at the end of this, we'll have some idea of the defining characteristics of SDN, and we'll look more carefully at the role in operator networks, the use cases that are being envisaged, and maybe some open issues of scalability, security, and so forth. And the hope is that the insights that you gather here today, you can take them away if you're an operator, from your own network evolution perspective, and if you're a product company, then maybe, or a vendor of some sort, you can utilize that for strategy. So before we kick off, let me ask the audience here a couple questions. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions, but the ones that ask you to raise your hands, first of all, let's find out, how many people at the end of the day today believe that we actually have a good definition of SDN? How many people believe that there's a good definition of SDN? How many people would be willing to stand up and define SDN? All right. So that's interesting. Now let me ask a couple of questions for the operators. So I want everyone to close their eyes. Please close your eyes. Do not look around. Do not open the eyes till we've told you to put your hands down until we start again. So please close your eyes, everyone. And how many people in the room are operators or working for an operator? Please raise your hands. How many people are working for operators? And please keep your hands up. Do not put them down, and keep your eyes closed. So now I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't put your hands down till the whole sequence is done. So, how many people have any SDN plans within the next 1 year? Any operators that have SDN plans within the next 1 year? All right. No, that's what. I'm not doing that on purpose. You know, the whole idea is we're not defining SDN. The whole debate is going to end up defining it. So I mean, those that believe that, you know, they're doing something in SDN. Now, how many people have a plan for the next 2 years, and maybe 2 years later, they envisage that their organizations might be doing something with SDN? All right, a few hands. And how many may have something going in 3 years' time? You know, if you don't have it today or tomorrow. All right, fine. Well, that makes the panel all the more interesting because then people have something to learn and utilize. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start off by, since the topic is what isn't SDN, it's going to be a more Socratic approach. We're going to go through a sequence of questions and quiz the panelists and maybe bring in your inputs as well. And maybe at the end of an hour or so, see if we have a better understanding of what is SDN by first understanding what it isn't. Alright, so let me start off with the first thought. And these are again collected from the industry, from a number of the panelists and you know, reading and researching what's going on in the industry today. And so the first thing is that SDN is not just about centralizing control. And you know, it's more than that. It's also what aspects of control we might centralize. So let me throw that open first of all, and I'll kick it off with Thomas here and ask him as an operator, you know, if it's not about centralizing control, Thomas, what is it and what should it be?
Okay. Centralizing control. So, quite possibly, well, the grand vision that had been advertised behind SDN was to allow some allow network operations to be the network operations practice to look like programming rather than cooking. So the question I have actually is whether this vision has to be achieved by more centralization of functions, or if it's just one way of doing so that has been explored in the, well, say, last 2 or 3 years. And I'm actually thinking that it's probably more balanced and will reveal to be more workable to distribute some functions and maybe centralize some of them, but which of these needs to be centralized has to be well thought about, because there's also a lot of value in having distributed state in a network. So typically the part that relates to controlling the data plane may not be the one that would benefit the most from centralization for quite obvious issues relating to redundancy and scaling. So that's my personal belief, but I'm actually open to hearing different opinions.
Sure.
So SDN is not about centralization, but SDN is about having a network view of what's going on. And you can do that by centralization, you can do that by many other ways. We build networks blocks at a time, we build services blocks at a time. That will not work. So it's about stepping back. It's about seeing the network, not the boxes in the network.
Andy, any other operator perspective?
Yeah. Spoken as an operator.
It's working, Andy.
Okay, thanks. We see SDN as possibly an opportunity for doing some things that we haven't been able to do before, such as rapidly speeding provisioning over what's been possible with existing models for network operation, but possibly giving our customers a programmable interface to the network. That's certainly another opportunity that we see here that might not have been possible before, at least not in an easy way. And as Vishal said in his introduction, we're also extremely interested in SDN as an enabler for other technologies, such as network function virtualization, which I'll be talking about tomorrow in my talk in the SDN track plug. So if you're interested in more details, you can come to my talk tomorrow. And other than that, it's just the possibility of being able to run our network more efficiently and be able to perhaps get onto the Moore's law curve of processor and memory and storage.
Okay, operators first.
Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, so for us, at least, we are counting on SDN to decrease the cost of network in terms of CapEx and OpEx. So if the SDN and virtualization doesn't prove to be cheaper, we will not do it. So it has to be less costly. And second, it has to enable new services which we could not do otherwise. So these are like two main criteria for us to use it.
And I think Dan has something to say from Axel's point of view.
Yeah, so I realized that I was not invited to be part of this panel, so thank you for having me. But I'm replacing Axel Klauberg from Deutsche Telekom because he was called away to another meeting and he asked me to sit in and he did not get everyone's permission. So I am here anyway. And a couple of points he wanted to bring across is that they're totally committed to this because the way the networks run today will not scale for them. And in particular, what they look to get out of it most is rapid service introduction. That's something they want to have under their control. And I just want to also bring up that I'm sure we all agree that we all know that SDN was really invented by conference organizers.
Yeah, go.
Okay, about centralized control. I think we have to differentiate between network function virtualization, as Eddie said, and this thing called SDN. They're not exactly the same thing. Now, when do you want centralized control? I think there's two reasons to emphasize the centralized portion. Number one is to be able to do optimization in a simpler fashion than using a distributed mechanism. I'm not saying you can't do optimization, let's say PCE or something about certain distributed amount, you can do it. But it's simpler when you have a database in one place and you can really look through it. And number two, what Dan was mentioning before, in order to make it easier to touch devices and implement something new. If we have something we want to deploy a new service, it's a lot easier to do it if we have some brain up on top which is telling everything else what to do. The problem is that, as I said before in my talk just before, there are certain functions which are much faster and give you better trade-offs if they're distributed as well.
Yeah, and a good example of that comes from the transport world, where, for example, you don't want to necessarily centralize fault detection and restoration functions, but you might want to centralize route computation, where you want the visibility of the entire network. But you don't really, but in fault detection and isolation, you don't really care about that.
And you might actually configure your restoration points and your bypasses in a centralized manner, but let them work
In a distributed
manner, and that's the kind of trade-off I was talking about before by using both.
Yes, Dave.
So I think you said this correctly, though it's not on the slide. It's not just about centralization. We have to realize that the software side of this, and the application ecosystem around being able to orchestrate networks is really the key piece. It's one of the main holes we have in the industry right now is that there is not an application ecosystem around programming networking devices, which leads me to the second point of if it's not just centralized control, the other piece, of course, are the programmatic interfaces. And I think what we've learned from this movement of SDN is that the programmatic interfaces become critical. One, because they need to be bidirectional, being able to program state into the device. And second, that we need to be able to extract information out of the network. And what's different this time, I believe, is that the programmatic interfaces are not just necessarily working on an element-by-element, link-by-link basis, but actually dealing with the abstraction of a path or the abstraction of a service. So if it's not just about centralization, it's certainly about the application ecosystem around networking. And it's certainly about the new programmatic interfaces, which allow us to program both persistent state and dynamic or ephemeral state into networking devices, which really wasn't discussed previously.
State not necessarily being data plane state, right?
State not necessarily being data plane state, correct. That we realize we want to be able to, of course, be able to program and extract control plane state, management state, identity state, as well as forwarding plane state.
Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, from our point of view, I think the important part is to make the service to be easier to program as well. So that's part of being able to deliver new services in a faster way. And if you want to program the service, you typically need to have this SDN controller to address the network end-to-end and address a lot of different parts of the network. So I would think that the centralization is a nice benefit of it, meaning that you centralize what you can, because from an OPEX perspective and so on, it's easier. But I think the important keyword is that the SDN control needs to extend next to end, and it doesn't have to be centralized, but it has to be global view of the network. And it could be like one central entity or multiple distributed entities that will be coordinated, but they need to be able to adjust the network end-to-end so that the services can be provided end-to-end.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Yes, Justin.
I agree with many of the things that have just been said. I think from our point of view, centralization really allows three things. The first thing is that it allows to have a global view of the network, so that I think that everyone agrees with that. The second part is that it also allows you to have a mechanism to collect information from the network in a centralized way, so in turn you can improve your route computation algorithms and mechanisms. But most importantly also it allows a single point of interface with third-party application developers, so they can also introduce new services in concert with service operators. So these three things I think make the centralization concept quite mature.
So it's certainly true that centralization allows this. The question is it the only way? And I believe that the three examples that you took, centralized view, central entry point for application, and third one was management or extract. Anyway, so these need not necessarily be implemented on the same server or entry point of the network. These can be different functions.
Correct. But
so they don't need to be implemented on one controller point of entry, right?
Exactly, but maybe one other important attribute is that it allows you to have much more flexible and simpler forwarding elements. By moving the complexity from the forwarding elements into a centralized controller, then you can have much more flexible and simpler forwarding elements, and the logic can be computed from a centralized controller environment.
Matthew?
To me, this seems to be mixing up forwarding and control, though. Now, I do think there's an element of centralizing control, but there's also an element, you still need to keep forwarding separate from that, as Yakov said earlier on. But there's also an element of distributing management to make the management system more agile and more able to scale with the network.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And when we say centralizing control, that's what we said earlier, that there are certain elements that can be centralized. So apparently there's a continuum on which we need to operate. And I guess the objective is to get the global view of the network. That's the goal we are aiming towards. For those elements that would make network resource utilization better. That's what I'm getting out of it. So any questions from the audience on what's been said so far? Or any thoughts vis-a-vis centralization and distributed stuff? So we touched on something that I was going to come later, which was we talked about programming services. And that's like two points down. We'll come to the middle point later, but let's jump into something like this. We said it's not just about programming networking elements, but it should be about enabling and programming services. And sort of my confusion was, well, how can you program services without programming the network elements first? What are we missing there? So I'm wondering if some of the panelists have a thought on that. Look at North America, you can look at Europe, and at the same time there is an innovative class of operators that are also coming up, that are faster, more agile, and the old guys are changing their ways. I mean, one of the most common arguments given is, oh well, we've got all these different groups in our company, and how can we even get to SDN-based programming? That sounds such a far-fetched concept. But then there are other operators that are actually merging those groups. They've merged their wireline and wireless groups, they've merged their IP and transport groups, and they're moving in that direction. Well, they're the ones that are probably a shoe-in for adopting some of these ideas architecturally and even from a software perspective.
So I think what the question is missing is that it's not just about how to
where we are going, but that may not be the only thing that it does. But let's see what.
I think one good example, coming back to your roaming example, I think one part is, as you said, enhance OSS to agree on SLA, whatever data modeling, what you want to activate. But if you look at roaming, today it doesn't work so well in the sense that local breakouts has not been implemented by many mobile operators. Because you don't want to local break your traffic in the foreign networks Why? Because they have different firewall, different, let's say, data plane elements. And this is where
interface. Are you saying that IMS is SDN?
No, but if you want to define a new behavior for forwarding or for interconnectivity, if you have a fully programmable controller and management environment, that's much easier than if you have a predefined set of behaviors and how your network should behave, and if all those behaviors are embedded in the hardware in a non-standard way.
So if I understand correctly, the turnaround cycle, let's say if I want to put a new service in IMS, I go to the ITU, it takes a year or two until it turns around. What you're saying is what you need is to be able to implement a new service in how much time?
Certainly less than years.
Exactly, less than in weeks, days.
In weeks or days.
If it can be done.
So that's your definition of SDN. It's like an IMS kind of system, open, that everyone knows how to do, and can implement a completely new service in days.
It's delivering services at the speed of software.
That's what SDN is not.
No, I think that's not, I mean, as Justin said, I mean, that's one of the things that will definitely be, should be possible. And again, one of the things I want to emphasize is we realize that we are at an early stage of evolution. I think that's pretty clear based on all the talks and discussions we've seen. Panelists, all right, so we understand their hiccups. We understand that we are, at the early stage of development. But if we look at what the different aspects that we are talking about, do we, in the panel and even in the audience, think that there's something valuable here beyond what we are able to do today that will be possible in the future, so that we are willing to go through those hiccups to get there? And that's, I think, a fundamental question that people should opine on.
So it's almost like crossing the chasm. This is a new technology, and so what we're doing with it is applying it to known existing problems.
Exactly.
And that has to get us, to the early adopters and maybe to the early majority. But then we will discover, gosh, this solves problems I didn't know I had or I didn't know I could solve. And there are proof points already. NTT last June launched their enterprise cloud service based on OpenFlow in a greenfield opportunity that gives them a new revenue model. And we are here because the operators are unhappy. And Yakov, I know that everything you've talked about can be true, but how many people have read his PhD thesis in physics? It's an impressive piece of work, and in it he definitively proves that airplanes can't fly.
No, but actually, I think you have a good point. No matter what SDN is, if it shakes up people, it gets them to look at things in new ways, try new things, that's great.
Yeah, and that's what I'm trying to get to. That do we even believe that this is a worthwhile endeavor and it's going to get us somewhere? And therefore, the journey that we are on, it's a worthwhile exercise to do and iron out some of the kinks. And even if it means, floating around for a while, trying to define what it is and so forth, at least we're thinking about, networks and services in perhaps new ways. And trying to solve the operator's problem, which is, how do you do things more efficiently? How do you do things cheaper and more agile? So. But the operators have said that the vendors are too far from delivering solutions, and it'd be good to see what the vendors think.
Okay, I jump in. Higher level abstractions or data models to control services or policies, we're not there yet. Not only we don't have abstractions yet, but we don't have standard abstractions yet. So some work is being started, so Dave at my right side certainly agree with me, but it's early work and we are not there yet. So